Welcome back to the Stephen A. Smith Show. Before I get on out of here, I had to talk about a story that's very, very important. And albeit indirectly, it involves Caitlin Clark.
Everyone thought they knew exactly how Caitlin Clark would handle her highly anticipated sophomore season, but absolutely nobody expected a physical altercation with her brand new head coach to completely break the internet and shift the entire landscape of professional basketball. For months, rumors had been swirling about the deeply shifting dynamics inside the Indiana Fever organization, especially following a highly controversial coaching overhaul that left fans completely divided and the locker room entirely on edge. The mainstream media assumed that bringing in a seasoned, battle-tested veteran like Stephanie White would immediately smooth out the rough edges of the franchise, providing the young superstar with the calming mentorship she supposedly lacked during her chaotic, physically brutal rookie campaign. Instead, the exact opposite happened, creating a terrifying powder keg of tension that finally exploded behind closed doors in a way that nobody could have predicted. Word of a massive, unprecedented blow-up began to leak through the deeply guarded cracks of the organization, whispering of a moment so incredibly intense that it left the rest of the coaching staff completely stunned and questioning the future of the franchise. It wasn't just a regular run-of-the-mill argument over defensive schemes, poor shot selection, or late-game rotations. This was a physical boundary being crossed when White forcefully grabbed Clark's arm to make a hard-nosed, unavoidable point during a high-stakes practice session. For a player who was already dealing with an astronomical, suffocating amount of national pressure, this violently aggressive coaching tactic was the ultimate spark thrown into a room full of gasoline. But the real shocker wasn't simply that the altercation occurred in the first place. It was how a national media titan intercepted the leaked information and broadcasted the sheer unadulterated reality of the situation to millions of viewers, completely altering the trajectory of Clark's career forever. The Indiana Fever front office knew they had a massive existential problem on their hands the very second the previous season officially ended in disappointment. The Christie side's era had been completely plagued with strange, heavily criticized play calling, incredibly confusing roster rotations, and a severe, almost negligent lack of physical protection for their generational franchise player. Throughout her entire rookie year, Clark was taking a brutal, exhausting beating on the hardwood every single night, absorbing incredibly hard flagrant fouls, vicious cheap shots away from the ball, and relentless, deeply personal trash talk from seasoned WNBA veterans who openly despised her meteoric rise to global fame. The front office executives sat in their boardrooms and quickly realized that playing nice and hoping for the best wasn't going to win them a championship, nor was it going to keep their golden goose healthy for the next decade. So they made the cutthroat, deeply unpopular decision to clean house completely and bring in Stephanie White to restore absolute order. White is famously known across the entire basketball world for her no-nonsense, aggressively blunt and deeply intimidating approach to the game. She doesn't care about massive shoe deals, multi-million-dollar commercial endorsements, or many millions of obsessive followers her players have on social media. She was hired for one specific, undeniable reason: to toughen up the roster, strip away the Hollywood glamour, and turn a talented group of girls into absolute, cold-blooded killers on the basketball court. Management essentially handed her the absolute keys to the franchise and gave her full, unwavering permission to push their most valuable asset to the absolute physical and mental limit. White walked into the practice facility on day one with a massive chip on her shoulder, fully intending to completely eradicate the celebrity status that had infected the locker room, and break the team down to their absolute core fundamentals. She immediately implemented grueling, lung-burning drills, demanded absolute defensive perfection, and flat-out refused to let anyone slide on missed assignments, especially her star point guard. But pushing a generational talent who already demands absolute perfection from herself is an incredibly dangerous, deeply volatile game to play, and everyone in the building knew a collision was absolutely inevitable. Tensions had been quietly but intensely simmering during the first few incredibly grueling sessions of this new militaristic regime. Clark is notoriously demanding of herself and everyone around her, possessing an extremely high basketball IQ that often heavily clashes with traditional old-school coaching methods. She sees complex plays developing 3 or 4 steps ahead of everyone else on the floor, which can lead to highly visible, deeply palpable frustration when her teammates or coaches aren't operating on that exact same elite frequency. During one particularly exhausting, physically demanding scrimmage focused entirely on defensive rotations, trapping, and fighting through aggressive, bruising screens, the underlying frustration finally reached an absolute boiling point. White stopped the live play completely, blowing her whistle with enough sheer force to echo violently through the empty, cavernous arena. She aggressively marched onto the court, loudly and bluntly criticizing a severe defensive lapse that had left the paint completely wide open for an easy layup. Clark, visibly exhausted, drenched in sweat, and heavily frustrated by the constant, momentum-killing stoppages, muttered something deeply dismissive under her breath and turned her back to walk toward the sideline to grab a towel. That exact, fleeting second was the moment the entire dynamic of the Indiana Fever franchise shifted permanently. White was absolutely not going to let her newly established authority be dismissed so easily by any player, regardless of how many collegiate records that player had broken or how many jerseys she sold globally. In a flash of pure, unadulterated old-school coaching aggression, White stepped directly into Clark's path, cutting off her escape route, and firmly grabbed her arm, forcefully pulling her back into the center of the huddle to look her dead in the incredibly surprised eyes. The entire gym went completely, terrifyingly dead silent. You could literally hear a pin drop on the hardwood as the entire roster, the training staff, and the assistant coaches completely froze in place, waiting to see exactly how the most famous, highly scrutinized women's basketball player on the entire planet would react to being physically manhandled by her brand new boss. It was a deeply terrifying split second of absolute uncertainty, where nobody in the building knew if Clark was going to furiously storm out of the facility, call her powerful agents, or demand a blockbuster trade on the spot. But what happened next wouldn't just shock the coaching staff. It would completely terrify the rest of the professional basketball world. Instead of shrinking away, complaining to the front office, or throwing a massive theatrical temper tantrum like the mainstream media so desperately loves to falsely portray her doing, Caitlin Clark's eyes darkened entirely, and she absolutely erupted from the inside out. She didn't scream uncontrollably at White, and she didn't utter a single DMN word of complaint. Instead, she aggressively yanked her arm back out of the coach's grasp, nodded sharply with a look of pure unhinged determination, and immediately demanded the basketball from the referee. What followed was wildly described by terrified insiders as 30 uninterrupted minutes of the most aggressive, breathtaking, and completely unguardable basketball anyone in that entire building had ever witnessed in their lives. Clark completely morphed into an absolute demon on the hardwood, channeling every single ounce of her pent-up frustration directly into her game. She immediately started picking up opposing guards full court, playing defense with a manic, suffocating intensity that completely shocked the defensive-minded coaching staff. On the offensive end, she completely stopped looking for polite, systemic passes, and started launching absolutely lethal, heavily contested three-pointers from the center logo, talking relentless, brutal trash to the exhausted practice squad defenders who were trying hopelessly to contain her fury. Every single time she scored a devastating basket, she shot a freezing, dead-eyed, deeply intimidating glare directly at Stephanie White standing on the sideline. She wasn't just executing the playbook anymore. She was making a terrifying, deeply personal statement. She was blatantly proving that if the new coaching regime desperately wanted a villain to lead their team, they were going to get an absolute, uncontrollable monster. She dropped dime after blinding dime, completely and effortlessly dissecting the complex defensive schemes White had just spent hours meticulously drawing up on the whiteboard, tearing the entire practice apart absolutely single-handedly. The assistant coaches stood there in entirely stunned silence, slowly realizing they had accidentally awakened a deeply terrifying version of Clark that operated on pure, unadulterated vengeance, rather than just competitive spirit. White didn't flinch or back down, standing her ground with a faint, deeply satisfied smirk on her face, knowing exactly what she had just intentionally unlocked in her young, phenomenal star. However, in today's highly connected, deeply obsessed sports media world, an emotional explosion of this incredible magnitude behind closed doors absolutely never stays a secret for very long. Stephen A. Smith, who has practically appointed himself the loud, unofficial guardian and ultimate defender of Caitlin Clark's growing legacy on national television, quickly got wind of this highly explosive, deeply confidential interaction. Sources deeply embedded inside the Indiana organization, who were completely blown away by what they had just witnessed, leaked the exact minute details of the physical arm grab and the subsequent nuclear 30-minute performance directly to his desk at ESPN. Stephen A. didn't waste a single precious second verifying the explosive details. He went straight on the air during first take, staring dead into the national camera lens, and completely validated the wild, unbelievable rumors that had been rapidly setting the internet ablaze all morning. He powerfully confirmed the physical altercation, detailing exactly how White had essentially crossed a massive professional line specifically to test the young star's absolute breaking point. But instead of going on a massive tirade calling for White's immediate firing or suspension, Stephen A. did something entirely unexpected that completely shocked his co-hosts. He passionately and loudly defended the aggressive interaction, completely flipping the script on the deeply sensitive mainstream narrative. He furiously argued that this brutal, unfiltered, incredibly uncomfortable friction is exactly the kind of harsh, tough love that historically forged absolute legends like Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant during their most formative years. He shouted deeply into the microphone, wildly explaining that the WNBA as a whole has been entirely too soft on its young superstars, relying heavily on friendly, sisterly relationships rather than demanding sheer, cutthroat dominance at all costs. According to his deeply connected, highly reliable sources, Stephen A. confirmed that Clark didn't just accept the coach's physical challenge. She completely and utterly obliterated it, proving she had the exact same psychotic, win-at-all-costs mentality as the game's greatest historical figures. He issued a massive, terrifying warning to the rest of the league, stating that the old days of Clark being a quiet, deeply polite rookie who just silently absorbs the physical abuse from jealous veterans are officially and permanently over. He painted a deeply terrifying picture for every opposing team on the schedule, loudly stating that Stephanie White had essentially weaponized Clark's deep-seated frustration, effectively pointing a fully loaded, highly destructive cannon directly at the rest of the WNBA. He emphatically stated that if other professional teams thought Clark was incredibly dangerous when she was just playing nice and trying to fit in, they are completely and hopelessly unprepared for the sheer unadulterated carnage she will unleash now that she is legitimately, permanently angry. But the massive fallout from this shocking television revelation wasn't just entirely contained to the loud media desks and Twitter debates. It sent absolute seismic shockwaves completely through the very locker room meant to support her. The entire internal dynamic inside the Indiana Fever locker room shifted entirely overnight following the widely leaked practice drama and Stephen A.'s explosive confirmation. Veteran, highly respected players like Kelsey Mitchell and Aaliyah Boston were suddenly thrust into a highly uncomfortable, deeply scrutinizing spotlight, forced to carefully navigate the intense, radiating new energy emanating from their superstar point guard. Some players quietly expressed immense, profound respect for the exact way Clark handled the physical confrontation, deeply admiring her absolute refusal to back down or cower away from the incredibly demanding new head coach. They clearly saw the dangerous, unquenchable fire in her eyes and instantly knew it was going to directly translate to substantially more wins, significantly larger future contracts, and a deeply terrifying, highly lucrative playoff run for everyone involved. However, absolutely not everyone in the building was entirely thrilled with the hostile, aggressively charged new atmosphere. Deeply concerning accusations quickly surfaced among the frustrated deep bench players that White was deliberately and maliciously trying to alienate Clark from her peers by aggressively pushing her into a toxic, hyper-individualistic mindset. The once close locker room essentially fractured and split into two distinct, deeply opposed camps. Those who were entirely ready to go to absolute war behind their ruthless, completely unhinged new leader, and those who strongly felt the old-school borderline physically aggressive coaching tactics were completely outdated, highly unnecessary, and deeply detrimental to team chemistry. The internal tension became incredibly palpable during mandatory team meetings and film sessions, with Clark now constantly operating in a state of hyperfocus that severely bordered on being openly intimidating to the younger rookies. She completely stopped trying to be everyone's fun best friend and entirely isolated herself inside her own massive competitive drive, routinely arriving at the dark practice facility hours before anyone else even woke up and leaving long after the janitorial staff had turned the stadium lights completely off. This relentless, deeply obsessive, almost psychotic behavior began to put a massive, suffocating amount of pressure on her teammates to somehow match her insane, unsustainable work ethic. If you weren't entirely willing to physically bleed on the hardwood for a loose ball, or completely exhaust yourself on a defensive rotation, Clark no longer had a single ounce of patience for you, and she openly let it be known with blistering, highly explicit verbal critiques during 5-on-5 drills. This ruthless, cold-blooded evolution was precisely the exact outcome that Stephanie White desperately wanted when she grabbed that arm. But it created an incredibly dangerous, deeply unstable tightrope for the entire franchise to walk as they prepared for the grueling season ahead. The WNBA front office executives and the highest levels of league management are reportedly watching this deeply explosive situation heavily unfold with a bizarre, conflicting mixture of sheer, unadulterated terror and undeniable massive dollar signs completely clouding their eyes. On one highly corporate hand, the professional league desperately needs Caitlin Clark to remain the incredibly marketable, universally beloved, squeaky clean face of women's basketball in order to continue selling out massive arenas across the country and successfully securing multi-billion-dollar television broadcasting deals. On the exact opposite hand, the sudden emergence of a deeply villainous, completely unhinged, fiercely aggressive version of Clark creates a deeply compelling, incredibly addictive television narrative that simply cannot be ignored by the casual sports fan. High-level executives are quietly, but intensely panicking about the very real potential for massive future on-court physical altercations, deeply knowing that Clark is now carrying a massive, incredibly heavy chip on her shoulder that could easily result in heavily penalized flagrant fouls, massive team-clearing brawls, or deeply aggressive, highly publicized confrontations with established rival players like Angel Reese or Diana Taurasi. The league itself has spent countless decades desperately trying to entirely sanitize its public image, heavily and routinely finding passionate players for even the absolute slightest hint of unsportsmanlike conduct or aggressive posturing. But how do you aggressively discipline or suspend the exact singular player who is almost entirely single-handedly keeping your entire league massively financially solvent and globally relevant? The deep-seated jealousy across the rest of the league has already hit an absolute undeniable critical mass with veteran players from heavily opposing teams. The deep-seated jealousy across the rest of the league had already reached a completely undeniable boiling point long before this explosive practice confrontation ever leaked to the public. Veteran stars who spent years grinding through half-empty arenas, microscopic media coverage and painfully low salaries were already struggling internally to accept the sudden reality that one young superstar had instantly become the entire financial engine of the WNBA almost overnight. Every sold-out arena, every skyrocketing television rating, every explosive sponsorship deal, and every mainstream headline somehow circled directly back to Caitlin Clark. And while many players publicly smiled through gritted teeth and praised the league's sudden popularity surge privately, there were whispers growing louder and more venomous by the day. Those whispers completely transformed after Stephen A. Smith detonated the story nationally. Because now, the narrative surrounding Clark wasn't just about fame anymore. It wasn't just about logo threes, flashy passes, or historic rookie numbers. It became something far more dangerous. She was suddenly being framed as a cold-blooded assassin molded by conflict, sharpened by humiliation, and completely reborn through confrontation. That terrified people around the league because every veteran understood one brutal truth about professional basketball. Truly great players don't break when pressure explodes around them. They evolve into something far more ruthless. And according to insiders, that evolution was already happening in real time. Multiple teams reportedly began quietly adjusting their defensive scouting reports specifically around Clark's increasingly aggressive mentality. Coaches noticed she was no longer simply reacting to physicality. She was initiating it. During closed preseason scrimmages, sources claimed Clark started fighting through screens with a level of force and anger that completely shocked opposing guards. She wasn't avoiding contact anymore. She was actively seeking it out, almost daring defenders to test her toughness again. The polite smiles and nervous rookie energy were gone entirely. In their place was a player operating with an almost frightening emotional intensity. One anonymous Western Conference scout reportedly described the change in terrifying detail. He claimed Clark now played like someone personally insulted her family before tip-off. That single description rapidly spread through league circles like wildfire. Opposing players started hearing stories from practice scrimmages that bordered on unbelievable. Clark was allegedly staying on the floor long after official practices ended, demanding one-on-one defensive drills against male practice players, refusing to leave until she physically exhausted herself completely. Trainers reportedly begged her to slow down, terrified about overuse injuries before the season even officially started. But she refused to ease up. According to people inside the organization, she became obsessed with proving that nobody in the league would ever physically intimidate her again. And that obsession began bleeding into every single aspect of the Fever organization. Film sessions reportedly became incredibly uncomfortable for teammates. Clark was no longer quietly absorbing criticism from the back row. She began openly challenging mistakes in real time, pausing clips herself, demanding sharper rotations, quicker closeouts, and more effort from everybody on the court. Veterans who were once accustomed to mentoring her suddenly found themselves being aggressively held accountable by the franchise's youngest superstar. Some respected it. Others absolutely hated it. Kelsey Mitchell, one of the most experienced scorers on the roster, allegedly found herself caught directly in the middle of the growing divide. On one side stood Stephanie White and the hardline coaching philosophy demanding maximum intensity every second of every practice. On the other side stood players who feared the entire locker room was becoming emotionally combustible. Mitchell reportedly attempted to calm tensions privately, reminding teammates that championships are never built through chaos alone. But by that point, the emotional momentum inside the organization had already become nearly impossible to control. Aaliyah Boston faced her own difficult challenge as well. Boston had naturally emerged as one of the emotional leaders of the team during Clark's rookie year, helping stabilize media pressure while acting as a calming voice inside the locker room. But now even she reportedly struggled to fully connect with the increasingly isolated version of Clark emerging under White's system. The once lighthearted chemistry between the two stars became noticeably more serious during practices and media appearances. Cameras started catching fewer laughs and more intensely focused conversations.